The child turned around before Garrett had time to process what he was seeing. Gray eyes the exact shade he'd spent 10 years trying to forget. And that slight tilt of the head, the kind of unconscious habit no one teaches and no one forgets. Nora stood right there, her face drained of color, one hand pressed firm against the girl's shoulder, like she could still contain something that had already escaped. 10 years. 10 years since the divorce. Papers were signed, without a single argument, without a single explanation. Garrett had told himself he understood why she left. Standing in the entrance of that restaurant, he realized he had understood nothing at all. Garrett Cole had a system for Saturday nights, and the system was simple. By 6:30, he and Owen were in the truck. By 7, they were seated somewhere with menus in hand. It wasn't romantic or meaningful in any grand sense. It was just the one ritual he'd managed to hold on to across 14 years of doing everything alone. The company could wait until Monday. The emails could stack. Saturday night belonged to the two of them, and Garrett protected that time the way he protected very little else in his life. Owen was 14 now, which meant he was mostly quiet in the truck and mostly on his phone at the table. But he still came. That counted for something. Garrett had learned not to push for conversation, not to ask questions that required more than a 2-word answer, not to make the evening feel like a scheduled check-in. He just drove, and Owen rode, and somewhere between the silence and the food, something that resembled connection still managed to happen. It wasn't the relationship Garrett had imagined when Owen was small, but it was real, and it was theirs. And most nights that was enough. The suggestion to go to the place on Lincoln Square had come from Owen himself, which was unusual enough that Garrett agreed without thinking twice. Owen had mentioned the potato soup, said he remembered it from when he was little, though Garrett wasn't sure how much of that was actual memory and how much was something he'd been told. Either way, they went. The neighborhood was cold that evening, the kind of mid-October cold that arrived without warning and reminded you that summer hadn't just ended, but had been gone for a while. The restaurant was warm inside amber light, the smell of butter and toasted bread pushing through the door before they even stepped in. The hostess told them it would be a few minutes. Garrett stood near the entrance with his coat still on, scanning the room out of habit. He always did that in restaurants. Some leftover instinct from years of client dinners where arriving unprepared cost you the table's advantage. That was when he saw her. Nora was sitting at a table near the far wall, her dark hair shorter than he remembered her shoulders, angled slightly away from the room as if she preferred not to be seen. And beside her, a girl, 9 years old, with the same dark hair, sitting with her chin propped on one hand, staring out the window at the street. Garrett's chest did something he didn't have a word for. The girl's posture, that particular way of resting her chin in her palm and going somewhere else in her head while the world moved around her, was so familiar, it felt like a trick. Owen did that exact thing every time he was waiting for something. Had done it since he was small enough to sit in a booster seat. Garrett stood at the entrance of that restaurant and told himself he was seeing a coincidence, that posture was not genetic evidence that he was projecting because he hadn't slept well, and his mind was working against him. He told himself all of that in the space of about 4 seconds. Then the hostess came back and told them their table was ready. The table was right next to Nora's. Of course it was. Nora looked up when they approached. The color left her face in a way that wasn't subtle. It was the kind of reaction that happened before a person could stop it, before the social training kicked in and smoothed everything over. She recovered quickly, but Garrett had already seen it. He pulled out his chair and sat down. Owen dropped into the seat across from him and immediately picked up the menu. Neither of them said anything to the table beside them, and the table beside them said nothing back. For about 30 seconds, everyone pretended the situation was normal. Then the girl reached for her glass, caught it wrong, and her spoon slid off the edge of the table. It landed near Owen's feet. Owen bent down without being asked, picked it up, and held it out toward the girl across the narrow divide between the two tables. She took it with both hands, and said thank you in a small, clear voice. Owen said no problem. They looked at each other for a moment, the way kids do, direct, uncomplicated, no performance involved, and then Owen went back to his menu. The girl went back to her window. Two strangers who would forget each other by morning. Garrett watched all of that and felt something tighten in his throat. He kept his eyes on his menu. The words on the page meant nothing. Beside him, Owen was asking whether they had the soup tonight, and Garrett said he thought so, and his voice came out steady enough that Owen didn't notice anything. Owen never noticed the small things. That was the difference between them. Garrett set his menu down and leaned slightly toward the next table. Nora was looking at her own menu, or pretending to. He kept his voice low enough that Owen, now examining the dessert section with more interest than the entrees, wouldn't catch it. "How old is she?" Garrett asked. That was all. 3 words, and they landed between him and Nora like something dropped from a height. Nora's eyes came up from the menu and met his. She didn't answer. She sat with the question in front of her for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds in which she could have said anything, could have deflected, or laughed it off, or given him a number, and she said nothing. The silence was its own kind of answer, and Garrett understood it the way you understand something you were never supposed to know. Across the table, Owen had decided on the soup and set his menu down with the quiet satisfaction of a person who'd resolved something important. He glanced at his father. "Did you figure out what you want?" he asked. Garrett looked at his son, 14 years old, dark-haired, gray-eyed, completely unaware of what had just happened 2 feet to his left, and nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I think I did." The dinner ended, the way dinners end, when one person at the table is holding something too large to set down. Owen finished his soup, declared it exactly as he remembered, and asked if they could get the apple tart. Garrett said yes. He ate what was in front of him without tasting any of it. At some point during the main course, Nora had asked for the check. By the time Owen was working through the tart, her table was empty. Garrett noticed without looking directly. He had spent the entire meal not looking directly at anything. He told himself he would let it go. He told himself this on the drive home with Owen beside him, talking about something that happened at school that week, a story that required occasional responses and nothing more. Garrett gave the responses. He kept both hands on the wheel. He told himself that what he had seen was a coincidence, that the girl's posture meant nothing, that a 3-second silence was not a confession. He told himself all of it, and believed none of it, and by the time they pulled into the driveway, he had stopped trying. He waited until Owen was upstairs before he found Nora's old number in his phone. Still there, never deleted, buried under contacts he actually used. He sent a message. Short, nothing. Accusatory. Just, "I think we need to talk." The message sat delivered for the rest of the night and was still sitting there the next morning. He tried calling the following day. The line rang 4 times and cut to a voicemail that had never been set up. He tried once more that evening. Same result. He found the number of a cousin they'd both known during the marriage, a woman named Patrice, who still sent him a Christmas card every year, out of what he assumed was habit or guilt. He left Patrice a message, asking her to pass along that he was trying to reach Nora. Patrice texted back 2 days later. She said she'll reach out when she's ready. Garrett read that message standing in his kitchen at 6 in the morning, coffee in hand, and felt something close to the feeling he'd had 10 years ago when the divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday with no prior conversation. The particular exhaustion of being told to wait by someone who has already decided the answer. 2 weeks passed. He went to work. He ran the company. He made Owen's lunches and signed the permission slip for the school field trip and sat through a parent-teacher conference where Owen's history teacher said he was bright but disengaged, and Garrett nodded and said he would talk to him, knowing full well that talking to Owen about engagement was roughly as productive as talking to a wall about architecture. Life continued in its ordinary shape, but every morning when he made his coffee, he did the same calculation in his head, ages, dates, timing, and every morning the numbers came out the same way. On a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the restaurant, Owen left for his volunteer shift at the county library. He'd been doing it since September, a school requirement that had somehow stuck past the requirement itself. Garrett appreciated that about his son. Owen didn't quit things, even things he'd started reluctantly. He came home that afternoon in a better mood than usual, dropping his jacket on the hook by the door and coming into the kitchen with the particular energy of someone who had something to say. "There was this girl at the library today," Owen said, pulling open the refrigerator. "Her name's Hazel. She's in 4th grade, comes with her class sometimes." He found the orange juice and poured a glass. "She's kind of weird, in a good way. She talks with her hands when she's thinking, like actually moves them around. I do that too. I didn't think anyone else did that." He drank the juice and set the glass in the sink. "She likes geography. Who likes geography in 4th grade?" Garrett had been standing at the counter with his coffee mug. He set it down, not because he was reacting, but because his hand made the decision before the rest of him caught up. Owen hadn't noticed the girl at the restaurant. He'd been looking at the menu, and the interaction with the spoon had been brief, and he had no reason to connect a girl named Hazel at the library to any girl he'd sat beside 2 weeks ago. But Garrett connected it immediately, and the connection hit him somewhere behind the sternum and stayed there. He asked, keeping his voice even, whether Owen had enjoyed the shift. Owen said, "Yeah, it was fine," and went upstairs. Garrett stood in the kitchen and understood that the situation had changed shape. It was no longer a question of whether he would find out the truth. The 2 children had already found each other on their own. Whatever happened next, they were already part of each other's story, and the only people who didn't know that yet were the children themselves. He called Patrice again that evening. This time he didn't leave a message. He simply said he needed Nora's current number, and that it was important, and that he was not interested in making anything difficult for anyone. Patrice called him back within the hour. 3 days later, Nora sent him a text with a time and a place, a small coffee shop in Wicker Park, Tuesday at noon. No greeting, no explanation. Just the address and the time. Garrett confirmed. He rearranged 2 meetings and told his assistant he'd be out for the middle of the day. She was already there when he arrived, seated at a corner table with her back to the wall and a cup in front of her that looked like it had been there long enough to go cold. Garrett ordered at the counter and carried his cup to the table. They looked at each other across the small surface, and for a moment neither of them said anything, not because it was comfortable, but because both of them were aware that whatever came next couldn't be unsaid. Nora looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Garrett imagined he looked the same. He had spent 10 years building a version of himself that didn't need explanations from anyone, and sitting across from her now, all of that felt like scaffolding around an empty frame. "She's mine," Garrett said. It wasn't a question, and he didn't make it one. Nora looked at her cup. Then she looked at him, and whatever she had prepared herself to say, she let it go. "Yes," she said. The word was flat, careful, the word of someone who had rehearsed it many times and still hadn't found a version that felt right. Garrett kept his hands around his cup. He waited. She continued in the same measured tone, filling in the parts he hadn't known that she had found out, 2 weeks after she signed the papers, that the process had already been set in motion, and she hadn't known how to stop it or reverse it or walk back into a marriage that had been unraveling for more than a year before either of them admitted it. She said she had been afraid of what he would do, of what lawyers would do, of what it would mean to have Hazel grow up as the center of a legal dispute between 2 people who had already failed at the simpler version of being together. She had watched something like that happen to her sister years before, and she had decided she would rather carry it alone. Garrett listened to all of it. He was not as angry as he expected to be, which surprised him. What he felt was closer to a kind of sorrow that had been waiting in a back room for 10 years and had finally been let out. When she finished, he said, 10 years. You didn't think once that I had a right to know. It came out quieter than he intended, which was probably better than the alternative. Nora didn't answer immediately. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "Do you actually know why you filed?" He looked at her. She held his gaze. "Or do you only remember your version of it?" Garrett had no answer. He had walked in with a clear sense of who had done what to whom, and she had just taken that clarity and put it somewhere he couldn't reach. He finished his coffee. They didn't resolve anything. He stood put on his coat and walked out into the cold. The question she'd asked followed him down the block and into the parking garage and all the way home. And it was still there when he sat down at the kitchen table that night and stared at nothing for a long time. 4 days later, Owen came home from school in the afternoon and went straight to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment, in a way that made Garrett look up from his laptop. There was something in the set of Owen's shoulders, not distress exactly, but a kind of weight, like he'd been carrying something since morning and had finally decided to put it on the table. He came in and sat down across from Garrett, and he placed a photograph flat on the table between them. It was the wedding photo, Garrett and Nora outdoors, young, and squinting into the sun, both of them smiling in the way people smile when they still believe the thing they're celebrating is permanent. Garrett recognized it immediately. He kept it in a box in the closet, not displayed, not hidden, just stored in the category of things that were true and didn't need to be looked at regularly. He hadn't realized Owen knew it existed. Owen said, "I saw you come out of a coffee shop on Tuesday. I was on the bus with Derek going through Wicker Park. You were talking to a woman, outside same woman, who was in the restaurant that night, the one you went out to the sidewalk to talk to while I was standing at the door." He tapped the photograph with one finger. "I found this. Her name was Nora, and the girl from the library. Hazel, she's the same girl from the restaurant. I put it together." He stopped there and looked at his father with eyes that were steady and gray and waiting. "Hazel is my sister, isn't she?" It wasn't a question either. Garrett looked at his son across the table, at this person he had raised from 4 years old, who had his mother's instincts and his father's eyes, and had apparently been paying closer attention than either of them had given him credit for. He could not lie to him. He had made a decision a long time ago on one of those early sleepless nights, when Owen was small and the house felt very large, that whatever else he failed at, he would not lie to his son about the things that mattered. He nodded. Owen sat with that for a moment. Then he stood, pushed the chair back, picked up the photograph, and walked to his room. The door closed. Not slammed, closed, deliberately and quietly, which was somehow worse. Garrett remained at the table. From down the hall, he could hear nothing, and the nothing was very loud. In 10 years of raising Owen alone, he had navigated homework crises and broken bones and the particular grief of a boy who grew up without a mother and had learned to pretend he didn't mind. He had managed all of it. He sat in his kitchen that night with his hands flat on the table and felt for the first time in all of that he had no idea what to do next. Owen ate nothing the next morning. Garrett made eggs the way Owen liked them, over easy a little salt, no pepper, and set the plate on the table at 7:15, the way he had done on every school morning for years. Owen came downstairs dressed backpack on and looked at the plate without sitting down. He said he wasn't hungry. Garrett didn't push. He wrapped the eggs in foil and left them on the counter in case Owen changed his mind, and then he drove him to school the same way he always did, taking the same route, stopping at the same light on Dahmen, where there was always a longer wait than made sense. Owen looked out the passenger window the entire ride. Not at his phone, not at anything specific, just out at the street at the ordinary Tuesday morning moving past the glass. When they reached the school, Owen opened the door and climbed out. And then he did something he hadn't done in probably 2 years. He turned back. He looked at Garrett through the open door for just a moment, not long enough to be a conversation, not long enough to require a response, and then he closed the door and walked toward the building. Garrett sat at the curb and watched him go, and understood that the look was not anger. It was something closer to grief, the quiet kind, the kind Owen had always been too self-contained to show. And it was directed not at his father, but at the shape of the thing itself, at the fact that there was a person in the world who was his sister, who had been his sister his entire life, and no one had told him. Garrett was back on the expressway when his phone rang through the truck speakers. Nora's number. He answered. Her voice was steady, controlled, in the way he recognized from the coffee shop, the voice of someone who had been holding something carefully for a long time and had become very good at it. She said that Hazel had asked her something the night before after dinner while Nora was washing dishes, and Hazel was sitting on the counter the way she apparently always did. The girl had asked simply, and without much preamble, whether she had a father. Not "Where is my father?" Not "Why don't I have one?" Just the baseline question offered in the matter-of-fact way that 9-year-olds sometimes ask the things adults spend years avoiding. Nora had told her, yes, of course she had a father. Hazel had accepted that and gone to brush her teeth, and the conversation had ended there for the girl. But it hadn't ended for Nora. Garrett took the next exit and pulled into a gas station lot and sat with the engine running. He and Nora talked for 11 minutes, he knew, because he checked the call log afterward, the way you check something to confirm that it was real. They didn't resolve the larger questions. They didn't discuss lawyers, or rights, or what the next year would look like. What they agreed on in the flat and careful language of two people who had already caused enough damage by saying the wrong things was that they needed to sit in the same room and figure out what to tell the children and how, and that this could not wait any longer. Neither of them wanted to be the reason Owen and Hazel found out from the wrong source at the wrong moment, with no one there to hold the shape of it steady. They settled on the following evening. Nora gave him her address. He wrote it on the back of a receipt from the glove compartment and drove to work. He showed up at her door at 6 the next evening. The house was a narrow 2-story in Andersonville. Gray siding, a small porch with a bench on it that had a child's jacket thrown over one arm. Nora had arranged for Hazel to be at a neighbor's for the evening. She answered the door and let him in without ceremony, and he followed her back to the kitchen, which was small and clean and smelled like something had been baked recently. She poured water from a pitcher on the counter and set a glass in front of him and sat down across the table. The kitchen felt like the right place for this, not a living room which would have felt staged, not a restaurant where anyone could see, just a table and 2 chairs, and the particular silence of a house where a child lives but is temporarily absent. They sat across from each other, and for a while, neither of them said anything that mattered. They talked about logistics, first-timing language, how much detail was appropriate for a 9-year-old versus what Owen at 14 would need to hear, stated plainly. Garrett said Owen already knew the essential fact. Nora said Hazel knew essentially nothing beyond the answer Nora had given her the night before. They agreed that the conversations would need to happen separately before they happened together, and that the children deserved honesty delivered with care, not with the weight of adult guilt loaded onto every sentence. But then the logistics ran out the way logistics do, and what was left underneath them was everything they had not said to each other in 10 years, and had not said for the year before that either. Garrett went first because he was the one who had arrived with the question she'd left him with. He had been sitting with it for days, turning it over, checking it from different angles. He said, "I think I filed because I didn't know what else to do." He looked at the table when he said it, then made himself look at her. "The company was in a bad stretch that year. I was gone before you woke up and home after you were asleep, and I told myself it was temporary, and I kept telling myself that for about 8 months until it wasn't temporary anymore. It was just the life, and by the time I looked up there was so much distance that I didn't know how to cross it. So I didn't. I filed instead." He stopped there. It was not an eloquent accounting of what he had done, but it was accurate. And accuracy felt more important than eloquence, in a kitchen in Andersonville at 6 in the evening with a glass of water in front of him. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I should have told you I was leaving before I left. I should have sat down and said, 'This isn't working, and I don't know how to fix it, and I need us to figure that out together.'" She straightened the glass in front of her, a small, habitual gesture. "Instead, I waited for you to notice, and you didn't notice, and I took that as confirmation of something I had already decided to believe. And then, when the papers came, I just signed them. Because at that point I thought it was what you wanted." She looked at him directly. "I found out about Hazel 2 weeks later, and I made the decision I made. And I have spent 9 years knowing it was the wrong one, and not knowing how to undo it, without making everything worse." There was no performance in the way she said it. She was not asking to be forgiven. She was just saying what was true the same way he had. They sat with all of it for a while. The refrigerator made a sound. Somewhere outside, a car passed. Garrett thought about the version of this conversation that might have happened 10 years ago if either of them had been capable of having it, and he understood that they probably hadn't been. They'd been 34 years old, and scared, and very bad at saying the things that needed to be said, and they had let that failure compound into something that 2 children were now going to have to navigate. That was the cost. He could see it clearly now, not as a wound or an injustice, but as a cost, the specific price of all that silence. And it was going to be paid by people who had nothing to do with the original decisions. Before he left, Nora made coffee. She moved to the counter and started the machine without asking him, and she didn't ask how he took it either. She just made it black, no sugar, and set it in front of him. He looked at the cup. He just picked it up and she drank hers, and they sat in that kitchen, and were 2 people who had once known each other well enough that some of it had apparently survived everything that came after. In the days that followed, they each had the conversations they needed to have with their children. Garrett sat with Owen at the kitchen table one evening after dinner, no preamble, no softening, and told him the full version of what had happened, the part Owen hadn't been able to piece together from photographs and bus windows. He told him that neither he nor Nora had handled things well, and that the cost of that had fallen on Owen and Hazel, and that he was sorry for his part in it. Owen listened without interrupting. When Garrett finished, Owen was quiet for a long time, and then he asked one question. "Does she know about me?" Garrett said she would soon. Owen nodded once, and got up to do the dishes, and that was the end of it for that night. It wasn't resolved. But it was open, and open was something Garrett hadn't expected to get so quickly from a 14-year-old, who communicated primarily in silences. The following Saturday they went back to the restaurant on Lincoln Square, not because it was symbolic, or maybe a little, because it was, but mainly because Owen knew the place, and Nora said Hazel would like the soup, and neutral ground that was also familiar felt like the right call. They took separate cars and arrived within 5 minutes of each other. Owen was quiet, walking in hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly forward. Hazel was the opposite. She looked at everything. Asked the hostess how long the restaurant had been there, and touched the edge of a framed photograph on the wall near the entrance. They were given a table for 4, the first time in any of their lives that had been the case. Both children knew the essential truth by then, that they shared a father, that the situation was complicated, in ways that took longer than one conversation to explain, and that the adults in their lives were trying to figure out how to make it work. Hazel had taken the news with the directness of a 9-year-old who had already known something was missing, and was simply relieved to have it named. Owen had taken it with the quiet steadiness that Garrett recognized as his own, the way of a person who processes things slowly and privately, and comes out the other side without making much noise about it. They hadn't yet decided what to call each other, or how often they would see each other, or what any of the future arrangements would look like. They had only decided to be in the same room at the same table, and to let the children lead from there. The children sat across from each other. Owen picked up the menu. Hazel picked up hers, held it for about 10 seconds, and then set it down, because she was more interested in Owen than in the menu. She asked him what he was going to get. He said the soup, probably. She said she'd never had it. He said it was good that he'd had it before, and it was worth it. She considered that with the seriousness of someone weighing an important decision, and then she nodded and said, "Okay." She'd get it too. Garrett watched this from across the table and felt something in his chest go quiet. Not resolved, not healed, just quiet. The way a room goes quiet after a long noise finally stops. Hazel asked Owen what his favorite subject was. Owen said geography, and something shifted in the girl's face, genuine surprise, unguarded and immediate. "Me too," she said. "Nobody ever believes me when I say that." Owen looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has just been told something they needed to hear. "Yeah," he said. "I know exactly what you mean." Garrett looked at Nora across the table. She was already looking at him. He said quietly, "She sounds like him." Nora looked at Owen, who was now explaining to Hazel the difference between political and physical maps, with more enthusiasm than he had shown about anything in recent memory. "He looks like you," she said. They didn't say anything else for a while. The smell of butter and toasted bread moved through the room, the same way it always had the amber light. The same. The warmth at the door, the same. Everything was the same as the first night, except that the table had 4 chairs around it, and all 4 were occupied. The next morning, Garrett woke at 6 and went to the kitchen. The house was still dark, the way it always was at that hour in late October, and he moved through it the way he always did, finding things by habit and memory. He filled the kettle, set it on the burner, took down the coffee. He went through the motions of a routine he had kept for 10 years, a routine built for one, maintained for one, reliable in the way that solitary things are reliable, because they have no one else to account for. He measured the coffee into the filter. He took his mug from the cabinet. And then he stood there for a moment in his quiet kitchen on a Sunday morning and took down a second mug. He set it beside the first. He didn't have a reason that he could have explained cleanly. He just did it, and it felt for the first time in a long time like the right number.